Hello, everybody, and welcome to this IFG event. Today, we're going to be looking at a word that probably nobody was thinking about, indeed, possibly hardly anyone had heard about just a week or so ago. Supermajority may be the OED word of the year. It's certainly emerged into the political discourse in the last couple of weeks. As opinion polls have been translated to possible seat shares, there have been increasing warnings from Conservatives about the risk that there will be a possible Labour supermajority. And although, of course, no votes have been cast yet, that is going to be our working assumption of what we may be facing this time next week. So today we're going to be asking, what is it like to govern with a big majority, or to be part of a massively reduced majority, reduced opposition? Is supermajority a word we should even be using at all when we talk about our parliamentary system? I'm joined by a fantastic panel with a super understanding of how Parliament works, of scrutiny, of government, and of British political history. I'm Jo Rutter. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute for Government. I'm joined by our director, Dr. Hannah White, who before she moved to IFG served in her early life as a parliamentary clerk. David Willits, Lord Willits, former Treasury colleague of mine, but more recently Conservative MP from 1992 to 2015, so covering that crucial period when the Conservatives went from being in government to out of government, and a former government minister. And last but by no means least, Professor Robert Saunders, yesterday won a prize, so congratulations, Robert, for that. Prize-winning constitutional historian, podcast, and we'll hear a bit more about that, from London's Queen Mary University. So hi, everybody. So you all know the form. Get asking questions on Slido, please, and let's kick off. So, Hannah, to start off, is there such a thing really as a supermajority? Is this just a concept that someone in Conservative Central Office has invented as a bit of a tactic to frighten voters into the polling booths? And does it make any difference in the UK system whether a government has a majority of 80? After all, the non-supermajority Boris Johnson won back in 2019, and a majority north of 100, 150.
Well, I think Boris Johnson thought that majority of 80 was pretty super when he won it. So the answer, Jill, in our system is there is no such thing as a supermajority. I believe it's a word which popped into Grant Shapps' head when he was giving a media interview, and that's how it has entered the lexicon at this moment. Supermajorities tend to be a thing in countries with written constitutions, and when they want to do things like change their constitution, which they feel there ought to be a higher bar for than just a simple majority vote in a legislature, they use a thing called a supermajority, where, say, 2/3 of elected members have to vote in order to make a change, and that happens, for example, in the US. Actually, memories are rather short because we did have a supermajority provision in the UK until quite recently in the form of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So actually, one of the ways under the FTPA that you could get an early election was by having 2/3 of MPs vote for it. And that was a very brief experiment, as it turned out, with having supermajorities in our system. Theresa May made use of it to get her election in 2017. And in the end, Boris Johnson got his supermajority to have an election in 2019. Although I think the difficulty for him of doing that is one of the things which led to the demise of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act and that experiment with supermajorities. So we don't really have it. And I think the point I'd want to make really is that in our system, we have a very executive-dominated House of Commons. So essentially, as soon as you have a majority in the House of Commons, even if it's as small as the one that Theresa May had after 2017, working with the DUP, you can do a lot of stuff. And you can control the timetable, you can determine what legislation is brought forward, and the executive is very powerful in our system. So having a majority of 80, as Boris Johnson did, means you can do a lot. And actually, you often have to worry more about your own backbenchers opposing what you're going to do than the opposition in those circumstances. But really, although there are other challenges that are thrown up for different parties, if you have a party with a very large majority, that isn't in some ways all that different to a party with a communal garden majority, like you might call Boris Johnson's.
So we used to always regard the fact that first past the post produce what we'd call maybe strong and stable majorities, allowing this sort of executive control as a positive feature of our system rather than constant negotiation, wrangling, parliamentary defeats and things like that. But Robert, I want to come on to you and just say, you've been looking, I think, at a series of podcasts with David Runciman at some lessons from past 20th century elections, I think. I listened to one about 1906. So where do you think it's most instructive to look and see what might happen if we have a government emerging, not with a slightly pejorative term of supermajority, but with a really big and hefty majority? Where should we look for lessons, both maybe for the governing party, but also for the opposition, of what to watch out for?
Well, I think there are lots of different examples that we might look to, because the British electoral system is set up to produce inflated majorities. And as you say, for years, we have been told that that is one of the strengths of first past the post, that it produces strong executive government. So we could look at majorities of 179 for Tony Blair, or 144 for Margaret Thatcher, 209 for Stanley Baldwin, or a whopping 490 for the national government in the 1930s. So this is a pretty consistent feature of British history. And I suppose there are maybe 2 points to make about that. The first is that in some ways in the British system, any majority over about 20 is a supermajority, because under the theory of parliamentary sovereignty, there are no special rules for changing the constitution. There are no special categories of legislation. You can abolish the monarchy, you can change the electoral system, you can annex France by a simple act of parliament. And it really doesn't matter whether your majority there is 10 or 200. So the Conservatives are using this term to try and say that there is going to be something radically new about this majority, when frankly, I think what they're worried about isn't that it's a supermajority, but simply that it's a Labour majority. So I think we should be very sceptical of this term. We should recognise that it's serving some polemical purposes. But perhaps the second point to make is that when we look back at those historical examples, it's quite striking that there isn't a particular correlation between the size of the majority and either the durability or the effectiveness of that government. So the massive landslide majorities of 1906 and 1945 are gone by 1910 and 1950. I think you could make a pretty good case that Margaret Thatcher's first government, with a majority of 44, was more effective than her second government in 1983, with a majority of 144. And in the last 14 years, I think you could make a pretty good case that the most stable period of government we've had has been the hung parliament of 2010 to 2015, when the Conservatives were governing in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. So I think we should be sceptical of this term. And I don't think we should assume that it's going to be some great constitutional milestone. It's simply going to expose the problems that have always been there in the British system, with the lack of constraints on a majority in executive power.
Thank you, Robert. That's a fascinating catalogue of actually relatively recent majorities. And I'm going to come now to David, because David's been, I think, in the Treasury and then in number 10 during Margaret Thatcher's government, and been in the smaller majority under John Major, when John Major lost his majority, but then was actually a minister in the coalition government, but also on the receiving end of various Blair, what we might now term, and we're going to put inverted commas around it, supermajorities in 1997, again in 2001. So David, what's it feel like in government? Is Robert right that actually, there's very, very little correlation between effective government and size of majority? And just how demoralizing is it to be an opposition which has seen lots of your colleagues kicked out, very few seats come back, and changing sides in Parliament? Just how does that actually feel, and how long does it take to recover from that psychological shock?
Yeah, well, again, you're asking me to relive the trauma of reassembling in Parliament after the 1997 Blair landslide. And of course, the first thing you notice as an MP is how crowded or not the voting lobbies are. So we all physically vote. And when you've got a healthy parliamentary group, when you've got several hundred MPs, the division lobbies are packed. And you've got 300 or more people there. My first recollection of the moment when the Blair landslide majority got home to me was the first vote afterwards, when suddenly the division lobbies felt half empty. With 160 MPs, you don't fill the division lobby. You go through and vote. As one colleague said to me, we've gone from economy class to business class. Suddenly got an empty division lobby, and similarly, if you're a lively, effective governing party, or you're an opposition party with a lot of MPs, all your benches are full when there's a debate or there's prime minister's questions. You can't fill the benches, and the number of people you can draw on to provide that constitutional function of Her Majesty's official opposition. The talent pool, the number of competent people that you can draw on, in order that whatever a minister says in Parliament at any time, there is always a competent person standing up at the opposition front bench to ask some pertinent questions and make some useful observations. Just providing that operation gets harder the smaller your group. So although it's not a sort of constitutional doctrine of a supermajority, all those things just get gradually harder the fewer the MPs you've got.
So, Hannah, I'm very interested in this point by David. I want to come back a bit to this point Robert was making about the relationship with effective government or whatever. Is there a sort of minimum number that required to perform an effective opposition? What does an opposition actually have to do? I mean, they chair some select committees. There are one or two that are critically reserved for the opposition. We have a designated official opposition. I don't know what happens if, under some scenarios, Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are vying from who is the official opposition. Can opposition parties ally to say, well, we're really the opposition, the way we saw negotiations in 2010 for who would govern? I mean, how does Parliament sort itself out to function with a very unbalanced thing? And physically, how is it if you've got 400 plus Labour MPs? Do they have to take ballots for who gets to sit into the budget debate? Does some of them spill over onto the opposition benches? What will the clerks all be thinking about at the moment about how they make this Parliament vaguely functional if there's really big imbalance in numbers between government and opposition?
Well, obviously, I mean, I think we don't need to get too excited about this. We don't know what the polls are going to end us up with. I mean, in terms of the physical space, there were about 200 seats on each side of the House. And if you want, which was a deliberate choice when the chamber was rebuilt after it was bombed in the Second World War, there was discussion of making it bigger, but the decision was no, we want a more sort of intimate debating space. If you want to get a seat for the budget, you have to turn up for prayers, and you have to put your cards down and book your seats. So new MPs will have to learn that practice. But no, if you have a lot, they can't all fit in at the same time. Some of them can go and sit in the galleries and so on, or watch from their offices these days if they don't get a seat. I mean, I think the most important thing to bear in mind is that Parliament decides on its own rules and practices. So if Parliament chooses, it can change the way things are done. But of course, you need a majority to change things. So you'd need the party with a large majority to see the sense in changing things. If there were, if you're in a situation with very small official opposition, there are two sets of things in parliamentary process. So there are a set of things where you end up with the responsibilities of the opposition being proportional to their size. So for select committee places, for select committee chairs, for places on bill committees, those sorts of things. There's a formula which is used to calculate how many seats each party gets. And so there will be far fewer if there is a very small opposition allocated to those parties. So in some ways, fewer jobs to fill. But then there are a set of things which are not proportionate to the size of the party, which are responsibilities for the official opposition. So, as David has said, turning up to open and close debates, to be there for question time, to do all those front bench roles, which are sort of effectively mirroring the cabinet, and also things like opposition days, backbench business days, all those things are not proportionate. There is a certain allocation of time for those things. The official opposition and then the third party get particular allocations of time. And I think if you ended up in a situation with sort of three small-sized opposition parties, so sort of a Conservative opposition, a larger than presently Lib Dem opposition, and a sizable number of SNP MPs, the House might decide that actually there is a need to provide some additional opportunities for the fourth party to participate, and it could do that. Just as with something like short money, it's agreed by the House. The House can agree something different if everyone decides that actually, for the benefits of scrutiny and the legitimacy of government, it's a good idea to rejig the procedures in some way.
But when you say the House, Hannah, you basically essentially mean the government in this scenario, unless there's a sort of big backbench rebellion very early on in the Parliament to say, no, parliamentary scrutiny matters and we're going to change the rules to help the opposition be more effective because we believe in good government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a government coming in with a majority can take one of two attitudes. They can say, fantastic, we can do what we like now and we're going to do it, which was, I would venture to suggest, somewhat the attitude that Boris Johnson took when he won his 80-seat majority. We don't have to have concession strategies for our legislation. We're not going to consider amendments because we don't have to, because we've got our majority. If you have a very large majority, I would perhaps naively suggest that in order to be legitimate as government and to make people not to be able to level the accusation at you that you were sort of an elective dictatorship and you were doing things without adequate scrutiny, you might want to consider ways in which you can facilitate scrutiny in the House. But as David said, whether that is then easy for the opposition parties if they have very small numbers is another matter, and you may end up with people with multiple jobs, sort of double hatting, which is tricky when you're also trying to do all the other things which MPs are in Parliament to do, representing their constituents and so on.
David, Robert mentioned that he didn't think there was that much relationship between what made an effective government and the size of the majority, drawing on the Thatcher period, that Thatcher 79 to 83 was more effective than Thatcher 83 to 87, or maybe beyond 87. Did it strike you as that? Is it harder actually to manage as a party with a big majority? Are you having to spend more time? You've got more backbenchers, don't see an immediate prospect of advancement. That was also an issue, I think, in the coalition, with some dissatisfied Conservative backbenchers who saw the jobs they expected to get going to Liberal Democrats. Is that a problem of party management?
Yes, I think large majorities can bring problems of party management, and you have a lot of frustrated backbenchers who need to be found useful work to do. But there's also I think if you move from the sort of constitutional position to the underlying political reality, governments in democracies encounter opponents. I'm not now talking about parliamentary opposition, opponents. And the question is where that lies. And I think we have two different examples. And under Margaret Thatcher, she definitely had a sense that the people who are really making it harder to do things, she had three groups. She had local authorities, she had trade unions, and she had the EU. And increasingly, she thought of her government as fighting against those three forces that were trying to stop her. Sometimes she was justified, other times not. And that became the kind of political dynamic of where's the opposition. I have to say, I think if you look at the Labour landslide of 1990, post-1997, it was Blair v. Brown. And in opposition, in the official opposition, we couldn't quite, for the first few years, we couldn't quite work out whether this was a terrible weakness of Labour, that they are having these endless, sometimes suppressed, sometimes open arguments between Blair and Brown, or whether in reality they were sucking the life out of the official opposition because the entire national political debate was taking place in the form of an argument between Brownites and Blairites. They had, as there were so many of them, they'd even managed to generate an opposition government dynamic. So there will be, I think, an interesting question was if there were to be a Labour government with a large majority, what would ministers find really makes their lives difficult? And the answer, I think, is pretty obvious. It's the lawyers and the judges and the legal system. In my experience now, every minister who arrives in government is surprised at how constrained they are by everything being justiciable. And that's why what Keir Starmer does, if he's prime minister, will be so interesting, because this is his own background, and he will find that all these things he says he wants to do to boost the real performance of the British economy, all the interest groups will be challenging him through the courts on all the things he wants to do, and he have a sort of Nixon goes to China moment and say, hang on. This is stopping the government do things for which we've got a massive majority. We need somehow to constrain all these legal challenges. Or will we hear again and again, when ministers are being interviewed on the state programs why they can't do things, that it's all being challenged in the courts, and meanwhile they can't build a pylon and they can't construct a nuclear power station or whatever. So there is a dynamic somewhere in a healthy, modern, diverse democracy where you get opposition. The interesting question is where it is.
Robert, I'm very interested in your perspective on this. Do you think David's right that actually when you get these sort of, solid majorities in Parliament, that Parliament ceases to be, if you like, the sort of fulcrum of debate, and actually the real scrutiny comes maybe from the media, maybe from external pressure groups, maybe using the courts as David has just outlined? Where do you think that, how do you think that sort of starts to play out based on observing previous examples of governments with big majorities?
The example I was thinking of when David was talking actually was the 1931 government, because if there's ever any meaning in the term supermajority, and as you can probably tell, I'm rather skeptical that there is, that would be the one, because in that election, the official opposition, the Labour Party, are reduced to 52 seats in Parliament. So you have a majority of, I think, around 493. So that is a situation in which the opposition can achieve nothing in Parliament, and therefore you would expect it very much to move outside of Parliament, and to a degree that does happen. But you also have a government at that point which is very worried about events in Europe, is very conscious of the dangers of political extremism and the fragility of democracy, and to some extent therefore wants to draw oppositional politics inside Parliament. So to some extent recognises that it has an interest in maintaining the sort of procedures and the forms of Parliament in a way that continue to give opposition a voice. And I think that is something that, if we have a very large Labour majority next week, would be wise for them to keep in mind too. Because if it is the case that the parties of the right are shattered in Parliament, they are still going to have very healthy representation in the Tory press. They're still going to have a dedicated news channel in GB News, which I suspect will become more important in the next Parliament. And the danger will be that the right increasingly positions itself against institutions in general. It goes down the line that our institutions are rigged, that the system, the establishment stands against us, and it will propel them further down that kind of anti-establishment, anti-institutions route. So while it's always difficult for governments not to use all of the tools that the Constitution gives you in British politics, there would actually be some sense in a Labour government thinking about how do we actually make sure that parties of the right do feel they are fairly treated in Parliament, and that we can persuade their voters that the issues that they care about are being given a voice and a hearing in Parliament.
Because, of course, even if we do get a big majority in seats, the votes, we're also seeing that this could happen off the back of perhaps a really quite small vote share for the party that wins a big majority. It's just a sort of function of the electoral system. I want to come on a bit to consequence of that. Hannah, if you had a government that came in, we've seen sort of significant parliamentary reform at the start of changes of government before. If you go to 1979, Norman St. John Stevens introducing departmental select committees. We saw the right reforms in 2010. If you had a government that, says it wants to restore trust in politics, make sort of politics relevant, and perhaps that basically has a bit of interest in restoring a bit of the balance between the executive and Parliament. What might be on your sort of parliamentary reform agenda to the new leader of the House? If you could write, an incoming brief of saying, actually, there may be question marks about the quality of parliamentary democracy and debate after this result. If you want to do something, here are some things you could have. What would be the Hannah White wish list for giving Parliament a bit more of a grip back over the executive?
How long do you have, Jill? So I think that the important thing to know about the two examples you cite, the right reforms and the select committee reforms, is that they were both well set up before those elections. So they weren't just ideas that people came up with during the course of a campaign, stuck in their manifesto and then did. They were things that the House and the committees had worked on beforehand. And we've not had any big process of that nature prior to this election. So I wouldn't expect anything very significant just for that reason. I think the big thing which the Commons really should focus on, although I'm not convinced that it's necessarily going to be a priority, is improving the quality of legislative scrutiny, particularly the scrutiny of secondary legislation, where the Hansard Society has done a lot of work thinking about how you might do that. But to be honest, it's something which has caused a lot of concern. The House of Lords was very concerned about this and wrote a number of really strongly worded reports in the last Parliament, just looking at how many powers were being given. Obviously, ministers need to take powers to do things. You can't do everything with primary legislation, but a lot's being done with secondary legislation, making powers with secondary legislation receiving much less scrutiny. And generally, the quality of primary legislative scrutiny having declined significantly, MPs spending less of their time on it and so on. And so I think giving thought to how to make engaging in the scrutiny of legislation a rewarding thing for MPs to be able to do in the same way as was done with select committees. I think we need a sort of select committee 2010 moment where that system was reinvigorated by elections for chairs. And really, we've seen people getting much more engaged in the work of select committees because it pays dividends for them also with their constituents, not only for the merit of doing it in and of itself. I think we need to think really hard about how to do that for legislative scrutiny too, and that is going to be particularly challenging if there is a large majority and sort of very few opposition members on committees. I should note that the Labour manifesto includes the commitment to a modernisation committee, which was something that the last Labour government had, and it talks about looking at ways of reforming the way Parliament works. It's not entirely clear what Lucy Powell, the current shadow leader of the House, has in mind for it to do, but it's interesting that it's there. So that's a sort of watch this space, I think.
She did speak at the Institute for Government just before the election was called, I think, didn't she?
She talked about improving legislative scrutiny, although, again, what exactly that transpires to mean, I think we have to wait and see. I think David wanted to come in and...
Yeah, David.
Yeah, and I very much agree with Hannah's point. And look, from the perspective of the House of Lords, we don't have many useful functions, but I would say, if anything, the most important single function we've got is the revising chamber, scrutinising legislation in a way that sadly no longer happens in the House of Commons, and it declined even during my time as an MP. I can remember when committee stage used to be a sort of big deal in the Commons. It isn't now, and but in the Lords it is. And of course, we are heavily constrained. It's not really the job of the Lords to challenge the government's fundamental strategy, and the Salisbury Convention means you wouldn't want to challenge stuff that was in the manifesto. So Labour's manifesto actually has not got as much as you might expect. But what was frustrating was when Boris had his majority of 80, it didn't matter if you painstakingly put together a cross-party coalition, and there were several amendments which I tabled working with other parties, and you send them back to the Commons, and they just get all reversed. Often what you're trying to do is, there is a group of unhappy MPs in the governing party. You're trying to give them an opportunity, a second opportunity to mount a minor rebellion where all they have to do is to vote to keep the amendment you've made in the Lords. But with a large Commons majority, the revising function of the Lords is very hard to carry out. And you could even imagine some package if there's a Labour government and they want to do a reform of the Lords, and there's obvious targets like the hereditaries or whatever, to include in that some kind of enhanced protection for at least the Lords when we're scrutinising legislation and not trying to alter its fundamental purpose.
Robert, any sort of thoughts about how Parliament might be reformed to get a better grip, particularly doing that? And obviously one of the things, I'm going to come on to this in a bit, but one of the things that government's big majorities always seem to assume is that those big majorities will go on forever and that they'll always be in government. I think a point Hannah's been making quite frequently when MPs have been relatively uninterested in the powers. They seem happy to hand the executive when it's an executive to their liking, as opposed to one that they might want to oppose down the line.
Well, scrutiny is already pretty poor in parliaments for the reasons that have been discussed. I mean, government has too much power to control and timetable debate. Parliamentary procedure is often quite obscure in ways that mean that MPs often don't really know what they're voting on in any case. And a kind of under-discussed point, I think, is that MPs have very little access to good research services other than their own party leaderships. So actually, if we wanted to, look at small steps that might include scrutiny, on my wish list would be a big boost to the House of Commons library that would actually make it easier for MPs to get access to really good impartial information about the questions that they're discussing. I think improving pre-legislative scrutiny would be a very good idea. But fundamentally, I think it's difficult to get away from the question of electoral reform, because the case against first past the post has always been that it distorts in election results and it inflates the majority of the winning party, and it's done that across the last 100 years and more. The Alliance in 1983 got 25% of the vote and 24 seats. Conversely, in 2015, the SNP got 50% of the vote in Scotland and 97% of the seats. Now, the case for first past the post has always been that it provides strong government and it, in a sense, corrects the errors of the electorate in cussedly voting for smaller parties. If we've now decided that we don't want strong government, that's a very bad thing because it's a supermajority, then it's very difficult to see what the case for first past the post actually is. And, I have to say the Tories are quite late to this party, but if they are actually going to join a serious discussion about electoral reform, then I think that's very welcome.
Okay, that actually picks up a question that's coming in quite a lot on Slido, is what does this mean for electoral reform? David, will the Conservatives become late converts to electoral reform, or even maybe does, if you were a Labour looking there thinking, well, we won this slightly by an accident of the sort of electoral splitting. We don't know what's going to happen on the right with that, whether that split will sustain through to 2028, 2029. We always know that allegedly Tony Blair was quite interested in pursuing electoral reform in 1997 until he felt he couldn't justify that in the light of that big majority that he's won. Do you think this will renew pressure for electoral reform? Will the Conservatives become big advocates for it? Is, of course, I think in the reform agenda to have electoral reform, as well as in the Liberal Democrats and Greens.
Well, you're inviting me to go through probably more speculative hoops and that, but I don't particularly want to go through all these at the moment. I mean, the fact is, if there is a Labour victory with a substantial majority, I think they will say, look, we can do with our majority whatever what Conservatives did with their majority. The view will be whatever kind of Boris Johnson did to us with his 80, we're perfectly well entitled to use the current system to do to you guys. I think electoral reform, and there's always Conservatives going into opposition. Remember, Quentin Hogg famously started to warn about elective dictatorship, which he hadn't warned about when he was in government. So there is that strand. I think there would be a different dynamic if there was a reform Conservative dynamic. Electoral reform plays out differently then when you may there would be a prior argument about what approach the Conservative Party takes to other parties on the right.
Mm.
So I wouldn't envisage. I don't know what would happen, but I don't think quite on the cards.
Okay, so all those people who think this is going to be a trigger for electoral reform on Slido may have to watch this space. But quite a lot of questions coming in, Hannah, about outside groups, people who say that, you know, with the sort of Parliament, you focus some of your lobbying on backbenchers, put time and effort into APPGs, maybe focus on the House of Lords. Does Parliament sort of decline if there's a big majority as a sort of focus for lobbying efforts and people just concentrate their fire on government, and maybe some of these extra parliamentary actors that David was mentioning in terms of the courts, in terms of elsewhere? I mean, does it mean that Parliament basically is reduced in significance as a focal point for those sorts of activities? If you're advising an advocacy group, you know, should they sort of actually, by directing, just concentrate on the government and actually forget about Parliament?
I mean, I certainly think if you have one party with a very large majority, the excitement of what is going on in Parliament reduces. As David has already said, you know, in the Labour years, actually, a lot of the sort of stuff that the press wanted to cover was the relationship between Blair and Brown, and it was about the intra-party dynamics rather than the inter-party dynamics. I mean, I think what we would always say at the Institute is that if you're lobbying to influence policy, by the time things have got to Parliament, often it's a bit late anyway. So yes, you can potentially persuade a group of backbenchers to try to put down an amendment, which seems less likely to be a successful strategy if the government has a very large majority, unless it is so inclined, you know, unless it has set its face to be a government that does want to listen and does want to see its legislation improved as much as possible, which of course we would hope. The Lords, as David has said, is possibly a more fertile place to try to get people to listen to those sorts of arguments. And again, it's possible if the government took the attitude that they're interested in the suggestions coming from the House of Lords and is going to consider them seriously, then that could work. But generally speaking, if you really want to change the way government policy is framed, getting involved at an earlier stage when those ideas are being formed in departments and the process of policy making is happening is a better, more surefire way of having a fundamental influence on the direction of policy, I think we would say. Select committees, I hope, will continue, even if there's a large majority, to be a productive way of raising issues, of looking at subjects. And their great benefit is that they work best when they work in a cross-party way. And even if they have a small number of opposition members on, hopefully that will continue to be the case. So I would hope that select committees would still be a set of people worth talking to.
That's very, very interesting. David, you, I think, spent a bit of time in the Whip's office.
Yeah.
Got quite a few questions. You may not feel it's your role to be advising, but if you do have a lot of backbenchers, I know this wasn't this who, don't have maybe very rapid aspirations to ministerial office. How do you go about managing that? What, as a sort of in a Whip mindset, what are the challenges of ensuring that people just don't fragment? I think one of the things that's been very notable about Boris Johnson's majority of 80, bequeathed to Liz Truss, slightly reduced, bequeathed to Rishi Sunak, slightly reduced, but still quite a hefty majority, is that the government hasn't really felt as though it's governing with a very significant majority because there's so many fragmented groups on the Conservatives. I mean, what would be a strategy for a governing party to try through a parliament to keep that majority together and stop people spinning into their own WhatsApp groups and campaigning and perhaps feeling emboldened to vote repeatedly against when they don't see much opposition coming or much threat coming from the other side.
Yes, there is a real challenge here, and especially with new MPs who may not be fully used to sort of party discipline as practiced conventionally in Parliament with the whips. Some of them may even turn up thinking that they have some responsibility personally to assess legislation and decide how to vote on it, rather than they are whipped as government MPs. And there are great. I remember in the day when after the Labour landslide of 1997, there was a new Labour MP who gave his maiden speech, who had previously been a London taxi driver. And after giving his speech, George Young spoke afterwards and said it was an excellent speech. But however, it was such a pity that having been a London taxi driver and now become a loyal Blairite MP, he'd no longer be able to give us the benefit of his political opinions. And so there is a sense that for these, it can be very frustrating. And you need to find useful things for them to do. Now, going back to the discussion of kind of how you have an influence, there are a lot of commissions and reviews in the Labour manifesto. So a very interesting question would be who gets to sit on these commissions and reviews and how they are structured. And you might, I'm thinking out loud here, you might want to put people who are heavily involved, MPs. Could you put MPs on these reviews and commissions or not if they've got some genuine expertise? You will certainly want to put them onto not just the official select committees, because that won't have enough places. You want to have party policy groups. You're actually trying to protect ministers a bit, because if you've got 400 MPs on your own side, although by and large MPs expect to have direct access to their own party's ministers, it's going to be quite tough. You need to structure it a bit, and with the message that if you join our transport policy group, you will get proper conversation to the transport secretary. But we don't particularly want to hear you on the Today programme criticising our transport policies. There's things like that where you have to create mechanisms for worthwhile engagement.
Robert, I don't know if you've got any sort of examples of good party management versus bad party management from the past, but I also want to bring you up another question that keeps on turning up on Slido, mostly from Anonymous, well done Anonymous, about terms and the fact that we now when I was sort of quite young, we thought that British governments changed all the time. We seem to go into sort of longish periods, but we've had a deep period of instability. If I really wanted to start embarking on a decade of national renewal, are there things I do when I've got my big majority that make it more or less likely that I might retain a decent working majority into a second term? Do you sow the seeds of that early, or are you just a sort of victim of events? And are there lessons that people could look to? Who would be the best example of someone who's managed that to learn from?
Well, on your first point about sort of lessons in party management, I think a really interesting example would be the Callaghan government from 1976 to 79, which has no effective majority at all. You know, it wins a majority of 3 seats in 1974, which almost immediately disappears. And it then takes that into an economic blizzard. And during the IMF crisis, Callaghan manages to hold together a cabinet that ranges from Tony Benn on one end of it to Dennis Healey on another. It takes something like 17 cabinet meetings to do it, but he manages it. And to some extent, there is a kind of lost art of party management that the current generation of politicians has sort of been socialized intellectually under the assumption that you have seats. And so party management doesn't really matter. It's not a surprise that someone like Rishi Sunak isn't very good at party management because he's never had to do it. Whereas someone like Callaghan had had decades and decades and decades of dealing with a very factious and very difficult party. So there may be some skills here that people need to relearn. And then on the point about achieving national renewal, I think there are kind of 2 models here. You could make a good case that 2 of the most radical reforming governments of the 20th century are the Liberal government of 1906 and the Attlee government of 1945, both of which lose their majority at the election that follows effectively. So they don't stay in power for very long, but they do very big things. When Tony Blair and New Labour came to power, they were very conscious of the record of Labour governments winning and then losing at the next election. Blair wanted to win 2 terms in a row, and so chose to govern in a different way that made 2 full terms more likely. So if you want to be a radical reforming government, you have 2 models there. Is it better to be a fairly short-lived government that leaves big structural reforms behind it, or to govern for 10 to 15 years and hope that that changes the political weather?
And Robert, is it your reading that it was the big radical reforms that the 1906 government did and that cost them their majority? If they'd been more Mingvazi in government, as we've come to phrase it, would they have actually had a second term? Would they have ended up doing more? Or was it other events or things that happened that basically meant that they couldn't sustain their big wins in 1906 and 1945 into the next election?
I think the story of almost every government is actually events. And something that we should remember in every election is that parliaments are very rarely dominated by the things that get discussed at the previous election. Nobody in 2019 was talking about COVID or furlough or war in Ukraine. No one in 2001 or 2005 was talking about the great financial crisis. The Attlee governments and the Wilson governments in the 60s are blown off course by economic hurricanes that are really not under their control. So we sort of run this fiction every 5 years that the party sets out a clear plan for government, and then that is what happens over the next 5 years. And one reason why I think parties should be a little bit warier about tying their hands on saying they're not going to raise this tax, they're not going to do that, they're not going to do the other, is because actually they don't know what fate is going to throw at them during their time in power.
Interesting questions coming here from Benedict Pavio from France 24 about a sort of related issue of trust in politics and trust in government. Hannah, if this may be irrelevant to the parliamentary arithmetic, but is there a manifesto that could restore trust in politics? Has been a big theme we're seeing throughout that bit of a row on Twitter yesterday as to whether the guy that asked whether you two are the sort of, best the country can offer. I should have looked at the US presidential debate and thought actually we were doing relatively well with Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in contention. But is there something that can be done, whatever the parliamentary arithmetic we end up, to actually make people think that politics is relevant to them and that they now have MPs they can trust in Parliament? Benedict's precise question is, should we ban betting, which seems to be more widespread than we thought. But anyway.
So I think the answer is there is no big bang solution to restoring trust in politics and government, but that absolutely doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and find all the small steps that we can take to improve it. I think generally one of the problems is about the public feeling that politicians promise things they can't deliver, and feeling let down. And that may be why we've seen both parties recently set themselves objectives, whether this was Rishi Sunak when he came into office, or I would say in aspects of the Labour manifesto for this election, where people, some of the reaction is, those are relatively unambitious goals which are being set. But actually, in this context that we're in and the economic situation we're in, even those things are going to be quite hard to achieve, as Rishi Sunak found with his 5 pledges. And even 40,000 additional NHS appointments a week, which is doesn't touch the sides in terms of the size of the NHS and the number of appointments the NHS is having. Even that is going to be hard to achieve. And so I think that to some extent politicians have clocked that actually it's better to underpromise and overdeliver than the other way around in terms of people trusting you. But there are also things where, in terms of the sort of ethics, standards in public life landscape, I think we can just do a lot better in our politics. And a lot of it is about some small structural changes that could be made very happily. The IFG, the UCL Constitution Unit, and the UK Governance Project sets all these out at the start of the week. More steps that can be taken to help people who are in public life not slip up in ways they don't intend to do. Fundamentally, most people in public life are there to do a good job, and they're aiming to perform a public service. But sometimes, whether it's about declaring their interests, declaring things that they've been lobbied on, and so on, they slip up. And actually, if we have better, more transparent, robust systems to help them get those things right, they can get on with the job and not end up with the objectives that their political parties are trying to achieve getting derailed by endless discussion about corruption and standards in public life.
David, if we have a lot of new MPs, can we do more to induct them better? Or is it just a question of them using some common sense, which seems to be a bit absent in some cases about the importance of their role and what's appropriate or inappropriate behaviour?
I think you put your finger on a really important point, Jill. I do think that, look, it's very likely that the new Parliament will have a very high number of new MPs, and they won't all know the conventions, the rules. They will have come sometimes from very different careers. So there's going to be inevitably a process of adjustment. And I think already induction is better than it was when I arrived a hell of a long time ago. The main thing I can remember from my arrival in 1992 was the talking to from the whip's office, where one of the whips said to us we should remember the story of W.G. Grace when there was a rather a new bowler was trying to bowl him out, and at the end of an over, Grace took the bowler aside and said, "The spectators are here to watch me bat, not to watch you bowl." And that we should remember that when we were putting questions to ministers. So that was about what we were, that was a sort of the level of training we had then. But I think the regulations and the requirements are much stricter than they were, and a good thing too. They could be changed further. I think also some understanding of how you can work with a department, how you can make parliamentary questions work. Some people are very good at extracting information from parliament using parliamentary questions. Others don't have any idea how you can most effectively use debates, things where you can press ministers for assurances in public. There's all those ways in which backbenchers, as you learn how the game operates, can actually make themselves useful. But you need help in finding out what they are.
Actually, I just want to ask you a question that's come in, David, from John H., who's asked, actually, when you're facing a big majority, when you were in opposition under Blair, did you actually cooperate with other opposition parties a lot? You've talked about cooperation in the Lords, but we've saw quite a lot of that during the Brexit years of cross-party cooperation, when frankly the fissure was within parties rather than between them more. I just wondered whether you would expect opposition parties to, because it could be quite a fragmented opposition, but will there be formal channels for opposition cooperation on some of the things?
Well, that's a very good question. And I remember when I was, for quite a long time, I was shadow work and pension secretary, and there was the Lib Dem spokesman was Steve Webb, Sir Steve Webb, a great guy who certainly knows his way around Social Security. And on the Labour backbenches was Frank Field, the late Frank Field. And I talked a lot to Steve and Frank. And in fact, and I was always thinking in the back of my mind what might happen if we didn't get an overall majority. And I remember clearing it, I think, with David Cameron, doing a joint press conference with Steve Webb as a joint Conservative, and I think I might even got Frank involved. So yes, you do try to work together, and it varied almost by what I don't recall is the successive leaders of the party having a sort of clear steer. Either you mustn't do it or you must do it. It depended on personal temperament, and I certainly thought it made our facing, say, another late Alistair Darling as Secretary of State. If the first three interventions he got after he had said something were from myself, Steve, and Frank. And we all had a similar line of concern and criticism. And even though he'd got a big majority, that did help shape the argument and shape the debate. So yeah, you can. The answer is yes, you can do that, and it can be quite effective.
And another question that's come in from Craig Stephen about effects on the devolved nations if there's a big majority in Westminster. But I'm also quite interested in we've got other sources of outside parliamentary voice in terms of the quite powerful mayors that we see defending their own regions. We saw some tension last year around the Uxbridge by-election. I mean, Robert, do you see a sort of multipolar conversation emerging, if not so much goes on maybe in Parliament, that people will be looking to some of the other sort of big national players, but spokesmen for their regions coming out? And, how might you sort of be handling that if the opposition is, say, coming from some Labour mayors who don't quite like the direction of a government?
So I think Hannah and David will both be better placed to talk about devolution. But I do think there's a really important point here, which is that scrutiny is not just a parliamentary responsibility, and that we are justly critical of the quality of scrutiny in Parliament. But actually, in a democratic society, it is something in which we as citizens also have a stake. And it's also about our media, our civic organizations. And I do think this election has been very alarming in terms of the quality of scrutiny that's gone on outside Parliament of the party's offers. This is a campaign that's been absolutely dominated by the polls. It's almost impossible to get past the question of what are the polls telling us is going to happen. And we're spending more time trying to predict the race than trying to scrutinise the choice. And if I have a hope for the 5th of July onwards, it's that once we can move past the torrential obsession with asteroids hitting the ground and polling emergencies, that we can actually find better ways to scrutinise what government is saying, what opposition is saying, what parties are promising, what we want from government, in a way that might actually help citizens to feel more engaged with politics, rather than simply feeling like they're kind of football fans in the stands, listening to endless analysis of the tactics and predictions of the results.
Very interesting. I take that as a bit of an implicit criticism that we're not, whatever. Lots of great content on manifestos on the IFG website. I could trail other organisations' manifesto analyses as well, but I won't. Hannah, does it make a difference? I mean, 97, we didn't have big city mayors, we didn't have devolution. Is that a difference now? I mean, Westminster does less.
Well, and I think Westminster is conscious that it should do less, and that actually devolving responsibility to the lowest level possible is a good thing. And a lot of progress has been made with setting up the male combined authorities over an increasing share of England. And I think both parties are interestingly sort of have similar views, signed up to that agenda. So hopefully that will continue. I think politically, as you say, there will be a big shift if, it's in some ways much easier to be a sort of local champion fighting against a central government of a different party than it is to be negotiating the politics of being from the same party. Obviously, we still have one Conservative there, but most of them are Labour. And if we have a Labour government, that process of being critical, showing you're standing up for your local area, achieving things for your local area that you can, go back and win points for, while not overly upsetting the people at the centre who you need to give you things. That will be a whole different ballgame, I think, for the mayors. But the centre also needs to think about how it can use those people to achieve its aims in a way which moves away, as I think most people acknowledge we need to do, from our very overly centralised system.
David, any thoughts on that as a last word before I wrap everything up?
I just want to make one other sort of constructive point about what Parliament can do, which is simply we shouldn't forget backbenchers and private members' bills. And if there are if there's a lot of Labour MPs, there will be quite a few Labour backbenchers getting private members' bills. And Simon Jenkins has a fantastic essay about Roy Jenkins in the New Statesman, about how Roy Jenkins actually worked with private members' bills to deliver a lot of his great liberal reforms as Home Secretary. And I think that is, and including for outside bodies, influencing Labour backbenchers, if they have a big majority on what should be in private members' bills, is another power to be used.
Okay, that's a really good point to end. So there are possibilities for backbenchers, even if they don't have any imminent ministerial office in prospect or can't even get a place on a select committee. Some very constructive ideas there. Of course, this may all be totally hypothetical. As we said, not a single vote has been cast yet. Well, actually, that's not true. Not a single vote has yet been counted, I think, is the critical thing. Postal votes are coming in. But I want to thank my excellent panel for slightly debunking the myth of the supermajority. Maybe not an OED word of the year, but maybe time to think about actually how Parliament works generally, big majorities, small majorities, or whatever. So thanks very much to Hannah White, Robert Saunders, and David Willits. See you all maybe the other side of the election for yet more IFG webinars. Thank you very much indeed.